So even in cases where the right decision is reached, that an appropriate judgment is reached, there is still, I argue, a harm that is visited upon the asylum applicants because of the nature of the epistemic injustice that arises through the process that results from the asylum policy instructions. So my aim, to be clear, is not to put forward a kind of silver bullet solution to this. I don't think those kinds of solutions are really available to us. The project is an ameliorative one, in the first instance, of better understanding the nature of the injustice, which I take to be a precondition of effectively addressing it. So the argument proceeds in 4 sections. The first section there that you can see sets out a little bit of the background to understanding UK Asylum Policy Instructions. I guess for a group of people who are interested in migration, some of this is pretty familiar to you, but I'll run through it very quickly. So as you'll know, the Geneva Convention defines a refugee as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. And the ground that LGBTQ claimants can use is the particular social group membership, right? So UNHCR itself notes that membership of a particular social group, so PSG, is the ground with the least clarity. But a clear criterion of that membership of is that membership of the particular social group must be immutable. That is stated absolutely clearly in the UK Asylum Policy Instruction. So, you know, despite the general perception that professing to be LGBTQ is an easy lie to tell to gain asylum, in practice, making a claim on this basis can be very, very difficult, and success often depends upon support from an informed and tenacious legal advisor and considerable documentary evidence. And there have been in the UK a range of what could charitably be described as puzzling reasons that have been given as grounds for refusal in various cases over the years. The relevant standard of proof in UK law is that it is reasonably likely that the claimant would face persecution if they were returned to their country of origin. So in law, this should be a forward-looking decision, right? It should rest on a forward-looking claim. But in practice, the API directs decision makers to test whether or not it is reasonably likely that a person is in fact LGBTQ. And that leads to a genuine problem, a genuine conundrum. How do you prove that you're gay? How do you prove what your sexual orientation is? How do you prove what your gender identity is? So prior to the 2015 Asylum Policy Instruction that was then updated in 2016, there was a fairly routine practice of significant invasions of privacy in the evidence that was accepted and in the questioning of caseworkers directed to applicants. So for example, it was fairly common to ask people about their sexual practices. There were cases of people submitting video evidence of them having sex as evidence of their sexual orientation. And paradoxically, you know, sometimes video evidence like that was accepted, sometimes it was rejected on the grounds that it could be faked. So there were clearly quite significant problems with the way these sorts of cases were being dealt with. There was a legal decision that was finally settled in 2014, which is the HJ case that I mentioned there, that rested on a separate point. That was there were a number of jurisdictions where, so not just in Britain, where the test of discretion was being applied. So the thought was that applicants could evade persecution simply by hiding their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the court judged that if you can only evade persecution by hiding something that fundamental about yourself, then you're still at risk of persecution. So you still have grounds for seeking asylum and being granted asylum. So that prompted a need for the UK government to change its asylum policy instructions, and the opportunity was taken at that point to more generally update the asylum policy instructions, not just to update the test of discretion, but to improve the asylum policy instructions quite significantly. And there was a real improvement in the 25th instruction. So discretion no longer applies, intimate material and intimate questioning was no longer accepted, and there was a move from a focus on behaviour as proof of one's genuinely being LGBTQ to a focus on identity as the ground for being able to prove that one is LGBTQ. And that is an improvement in certain ways, but as I unpack in the paper and as I'll go on to explain, I think some really problematic aspects of it, aspects of the Home Office's processes remain as a result of the new instructions and the focus on identity. So if we can scroll down to the second part, Saskia, I don't know if you can hear me. If we can scroll down to point 2, ways of not being gay enough for asylum. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I do have a bit of fun with this in the paper because some of it really is absurd. But this is not, to be honest, my original research. This is other people's research that I borrow to then build the case that I want to make. But in the paper, I do spend a bit of time unpacking the multiple ways in which people are constructed as not being gay enough to get asylum in the UK, according to the reasons given for rejection in letters from the UK Home Office. So if you have ever had an opposite sex partner, for example, if you have been married, and especially if you've been married and had kids, then that has been cited a number of times as being evidence that your claim to be LGBTQ is not credible. So Elton John and Oscar Wilde are not credibly gay according to the UK Home Office, right? A much more problematic one in a sense, I mean that first one's pretty problematic, but this next one is more problematic because it's written into the asylum policy instructions now, that caseworkers are directed to explore a potential sense of conflict between a person's religious convictions or the dominant religious convictions of their community and their sexual orientation or gender identity. So there is a presumption within the instructions that if you are gay, if you're a lesbian, if you are trans, you will experience that as being at odds with religious belief or with the religious traditions of your community. Another thing that's written into the asylum policy instructions is a directive to caseworkers to focus on the coming out narrative, the experience over time of a developing consciousness of being different from your peers and having a sort of eureka moment at some point that leads you to identify as being gay, queer, whatever it is. And that is a sort of, I will argue anyway, a very kind of Western conceptualization of what and how it develops a gay identity or a queer identity or a bisexual identity or trans identity is. Not presenting oneself in stereotypically LGBTQ ways, not having statements of support from LGBTQ organizations, although again, that is an element of the evidentiary basis that is quite paradoxically treated by the Home Office, actually. One thing to notice in all of this is that it's hard to prove a history of something that you have had very good reason to hide. And that applies equally in other sorts of cases in some ways. But this isn't something that I think is adequately taken account of in the Asylum Policy Instructions. Moreover, there are very, very clear stereotypes embedded within the Asylum Policy Instructions that lead decision makers to expect an LGBTQ identity consistent with Western tropes of what it is to be LGBTQ. And these tropes are, I think, particularly disadvantageous to some groups. And we see this in empirical research that's been conducted in the UK, but also in Germany, and there may be research I'm unaware of in the Netherlands, that shows that women, particularly African women who've been married at a young age, are much more likely to have their claims rejected if they're claiming on the grounds of fear of persecution because they're LGBTQ, than are single men who are well networked with LGBTQ organizations through social media and things like that. Okay, so we have a sense of it. If I can scroll down to the next bit. I'm a normative political theorist by training and by disposition. So my sort of next step is always to turn to look at what have normative political theorists said about this. And there's a huge literature in normative political theory about immigration, but it says very little. That literature says very little about discrimination, really. So if we look at the queer studies literature, we find people like Martin F. Manallinson, who says that the dominant ethnocentric model views queer migration as a movement from repression to liberation. So there's this expectation kind of built into the construction of things that LGBTQ people are moving from a circumstance of darkness and oppression to a circumstance of freedom, and they're expected to act accordingly. By enacting the expressions of gay freedoms that are understood as such in stereotypes of LGBTQ performativity in the West, by, for example, going to gay clubs, attending Pride, and so on. So if it's understood, for example, to be axiomatic of being a gay man, that one joins Grindr and has casual sex with multiple partners, then the purpose of fleeing Uganda as a gay man is to be able to engage in such behavior without fear of persecution, right? So, and the point here to note is that that background kind of conceptualization of the relationship between Western spaces and spaces in the global South in relation to our understanding of sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity, that has an impact on our practices of immigration control and on our theorizing of immigration. So Sarah Fine, rightly, in my view, calls attention to a blind spot in normative theorizing on immigration. And she says that most scholars begin from the premise that discrimination on the grounds of race, she's talking about racism, cannot be a legitimate ground for restricting immigration. They therefore assume that their theories don't need to engage in a substantive way with racial discrimination as an issue in immigration theory. So it's an issue in immigration practice, but it just doesn't get talked about very much in normative theorizing about immigration. Now, I think Fine is right that one cannot insulate theorizing about immigration control as a practice from the actual history of immigration control. So in the past, racialized categorizing in immigration policy has quite obviously been used to enact racial discrimination. And I think we can say the same thing at work in family reunification policies that are still, for the most part, organized around heteronormative visions of the nuclear family. So by specifying what kinds of family can be recognized in immigration policy, one thereby creates categories of normality and deviance both within the receiving state and amongst the population seeking to enter it. We can go further, I think, and note that it's not simply that LGBTQ asylum seekers face a problem in convincing immigration officials that they are LGBTQ if they happen to have had a relationship with an opposite sex partner at some point, that is, their previous membership in a heteronormative vision of the family necessarily excludes them from the deviant status that would qualify them for asylum. It is also the case that the structure of the membership of a particular social group ground for asylum is formulated and conceptualized in ways that reflect a given understanding of sexuality in particular that I want to argue is contrary to some people's anyway lived sense of themselves as having, well, as being an LGBTQ person, which has to be in the asylum policy instructions, in fact, having an LGBTQ identity. So the framework says, the asylum policy instructions say, LGBTQ people can be granted asylum on the grounds of their membership of a particular social group, where such membership is axiomatically understood to be immutable. This demand is predicated on an understanding of sexual orientation or gender identity as an immutable fact about human beings, a truth that can be discovered about subjects, and not an experience that is created or that is fluidly and changingly produced by a mixture of experience and affect, so internal factors, that are then understood and articulated within the terms available in the conceptual and institutional language, so external factors that confer meaning and terminology for expressing that experience and affect. And I think from Foucault to Butler and on, we can find, quite familiarly, the idea that the expression and indeed the conceptualization of sexuality in the understanding of sexuality as an identity is something that is shaped and structured by the conceptual frameworks available to us. As Cyril Gauche puts it, there is no identity of the homosexual that predates attempts to regulate homosexuality. And immigration controls, immigration policies have been part of that framework of regulation, and therefore part of that framework of construction. And we still see that now, I think, in the asylum policy instructions. So following on from this point, we turn to the question of identity itself. The PSG criterion and the ways in which the API, the Asylum Policy Instruction, directs decision makers to establish whether this criterion is met, presumes an automatic, indeed axiomatic, relationship between an immutable sexuality and an attendant identity. It takes sexuality or gender identity to be determinative of identity in a larger sense, whereas the identities of straight people are not presumed to hang on their sexuality first and foremost. The sexual orientation or gender identity of LGBTQ people is presumed to be the essence of their identity, not just in widely understood social discourses, but explicitly in the API directing decision makers. The key point is this: the sense of oneself as defined by an LGBTQ identity may be quite alien to the individual and is certainly experienced as such by some asylum seekers, but that presents serious problems for the asylum applicant seeking refuge on the grounds that they fear persecution because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The asylum regime requires that they can attest accurately to their membership of a particular social group and that that membership be immutable. I think we can scroll down a bit more if we can, and I'll move on to section 4. I've lost my clock on my screen, so I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I think I'm okay. Got 5 minutes? Okay. So one might read the issues that I'm talking about here as a straightforward class of testimonial injustice, which is a term put forward by Miranda Fricker in her 2007 book. So this objection goes as follows: in contemporary societies like the UK, where immigration is high on the list of publicly debated political concerns, all asylum seekers, indeed the majority of immigrants, face a degree of skepticism that frequently results in a credibility deficit, right? The effect of the culture of suspicion and hostility on asylum applications is well documented. Testimonial injustice is indeed an injustice, but it is hardly unique or peculiar to LGBTQ refugees, right? That is a reasonable concern or objection to put forward in relation to what I'm saying. But what I want to suggest is that what I've described is not a straightforward case of testimonial injustice, as is faced by other asylum seekers. LGBTQ asylum seekers are not disbelieved for the simple reason that they are greeted with the general suspicion and hostility that devalues the testimony of asylum seekers in general. What has emerged in my argument is that LGBTQ asylum seekers are routinely denied the opportunity to articulate their sense of their own lived experience of being LGBTQ in their own terms, because those experiences do not cohere with the understanding and conceptual frameworks of decision makers pertaining to sexuality and gender identity as set out in the Asylum Policy Instructions. It is not simply that someone who claims to be gay is found not credible because of a general prejudice about asylum seekers. Within the conceptual framework and epistemic resources guiding decision makers, one could not be understood to be LGBTQ on terms that deviate from the established concept of gay man, queer woman, and so on. This is not just a credibility deficit. It is more like an incapacity to hear the testimony that says, my experience of being gay does not match your expectations of what a gay person is. And we might characterize that as an example of what Paul House Jr. calls willful hermeneutic ignorance. And so she explains this as follows. Willful hermeneutic ignorance can be more than an act of not seeing parts of the world. It can manifest in a systemic and coordinated misinterpretation of the world. It is a particularly insidious type of knowledge that blocks the transmission of it's a particularly insidious type of ignorance that blocks the transmission of knowledge that ought to make a normative claim on those for whom the knowledge is intended, presenting instead a distorted picture resulting from faulty epistemic resources. So there's a burgeoning literature in kind of social epistemology on epistemic injustice. And I'm not going to get too deeply into that here, but one of the things that I'm interested in about it is the ways in which the absence of adequate hermeneutic resources is sometimes sort of conceptualized as a structural injustice, so there's no individually blameworthy agent in it. So much of the debate focuses on epistemic agents as individuals. But many of the most important epistemic endeavors in public life are performed by institutions, by courts, asylum tribunals, of course, universities and other places of inquiry. And in the present example, the Asylum Policy Instructions provide an interpretive framework to enable decision makers to reach a judgment on the credibility of asylum seekers' claims. They are an institutionalized hermeneutic resource. To the extent that they embed within the asylum process certain ways of understanding the relationship between sexual orientation and gender identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religion, they may be understood as directing decision makers towards willful hermeneutic ignorance in the terms that Paul House describes. They may be said to constitute institutionalized hermeneutic ignorance. That is, an institutionalized failure, indeed refusal, to attend to testimony that says, my experience of being LGBTQ does not match your expectations of it. Decision makers are therefore primed to disregard the testimony of LGBTQ asylum seekers by 1, a culture of suspicion that leads to a general credibility deficit in asylum seekers, 2, by their absorption of socially produced stereotypes of sexuality and gender identity that direct them to expect certain norms of self-understanding on the part of LGBTQ applicants. Thus, the process by which LGBTQ people can claim asylum in the UK institutionalizes this injustice and visits this injustice on people regardless of the decision that is made. So even where the right decision, as it were, is made in a given case, whether someone is given the right to stay or not, the process itself is unjust for the reasons set out here. For most LGBTQ people, the acceptability of their claim will rest on whether they can present a credible claim that they are in fact LGBTQ. This requires that the claimants present an account of how they feel about themselves, But for those feelings to be intelligible, they will have to cohere to a reasonable degree with the hermeneutic resources deployed by the UK government in the Asylum Policy Instructions, which institutionalize shared conceptualizations of what being LGBTQ is. The fact that such conceptualizations are socially produced indicates that asylum decisions are not made in a vacuum, and British decision makers and British society in general, still cleaves to some stereotypes in relation to LGBTQ people, particularly in mainstream media. Decision makers are, of course, drawn from the general population. So a really important organization that supports gay, lesbian, and trans asylum seekers, UK LGIG, has recommended better training of decision makers to address the persistent assumption that LGBTQ people will experience a conflict between their faith and their sexuality or gender identity. But what I'm suggesting is that while that would be welcome, it follows from the analysis that I've put forward that such retraining is likely to be inadequate without, it's unlikely to be sufficient without adequate revision of the APIs themselves and a much wider project of fostering attention to marginalized voices in the social production of conceptualizations of sexuality and gender identity. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kerri. That was super clear. So we are in the luxurious position of having a relatively manageable group here today. So what I would suggest is if you can use the raise hand function. So that's in the chat function, you can raise your hand if you have a comment to make, and I would give you the floor. You can unmute yourself if you like. If for whatever reason of connections or such, you are unable to use your mic, then just feel free to type your question in the chat directly to me. Is there anyone I can give the floor to kick us off?
Thank you to Laura, who sent me a link to something. I will have a look at that. That's great. Thank you so much.
If for whatever reason you can't find the raise hand button, you can also wave at me. Yeah, I'll try to see you. Yeah, Johan.
Thanks very much, Kerri. I very much enjoyed this. It was super interesting and super important. So I would have perhaps two questions, and the first concerns your use of Fricker. So I was going over her text briefly while you were presenting your work, but I was wondering the extent, I'm sorry. So isn't it the case that for her, the wrong in hermeneutical injustice involves forms of harm, like either primary harms or secondary harms? And if so, then I'm not quite sure what harms would be constituting the hermeneutical injustice in the case of, so you seem to want to argue that there's also, even if the right decision is being made, there could be a procedural injustice in the process, in a failure to, like in a culpable failure to refuse to accept narratives that allow these asylum seekers to make sense of their claims. But insofar as there's no harm done, namely the right decision is being made, where would you place the wrong? So this first question would indeed be asking you to what extent you're departing from Fricker's harm-based conceptions of wrong involved in hermeneutical injustice by trying to argue that there is also a procedural injustice. Was that clear enough? I'm sorry for expressing myself poorly.
No, sorry. It's I think it's clear. I think I got it. I just got distracted by. I'm also keeping one eye on the questions popping up in the chat, and then realizing the question in the chat wasn't for me. So it's fine. Sorry, I apologize. So thank you for the question. Yeah. I don't. On Fricker. So I think I depart from Fricker. I skipped most of that bit of the paper because I wasn't sure how much this was a theory audience and how much not. But if I have correct recollection of Fricker, for her, the hermeneutic injustice arises in a way that it's sort of no one is culpable for it, right? So there's no individual wrongdoer. So why I sort of go down a path of talking about her a bit in the paper, I mean, partly because if you're talking about testimonial injustice and credibility deficits, you just kind of have to. But what I am interested in there is that I think that Fricker misses a trick, and Paul House Jr. has made this point before me, in not thinking about the ways in which power relations affect the structural injustice that's underpinning the hermeneutic injustice. So Fricker's classic example is sexual harassment, right? And her thought is that we didn't have the concept of sexual harassment. And it seems a bit odd to say that men didn't know that they were engaged in part of a hermeneutic injustice in their obviously problematic behavior, right? And so to frame it as a structural injustice seems to, I mean, this is putting it a bit strongly, but seems to presume an innocence that isn't equally there, right? So if Paul House Jr. picks up on that and comes up with this theory of willful hermeneutic ignorance, which I think is really useful, right? Because it's about saying that we have examples of people who are situated such that it is advantageous for them for this hermeneutic gap to persist. And if they fail to attend to testimony that would allow them to see that there's a gap, then that is willful, right? And therefore culpable. So I think that helps, but I think that is still only talking at the level of individuals. And what I'm trying to develop in that section of the paper is the thought that, well, an awful lot of this, insofar as it affects our lives, is gaps that happen, hermeneutic gaps that happen and affect the processes of institutions. And I think what I see in the way that the asylum policy instruction is written is a fairly willful and determined, I would say, example of an institutionally produced hermeneutic injustice. So then if that holds, then the question arises, what is the harm that exists if the right decision is made, right? So I think, I mean, so here the paper is underdeveloped. I will hold my hand up and say that, right? But here I think that there is potentially a fairly strong duty to attend to the testimony of people who have experienced trauma in respectful ways. And I think that's a very big claim, and I think there's a lot to unpack in it. But I think if we can accept that claim at a general level, then if you have asylum policy instructions that make it impossible, pretty much, for people who have experienced the trauma of having to leave their country because of their sexuality, because of their gender identity, then you visit a harm on them by creating a system that makes it impossible for them to tell their story on their own terms. I mean, I think you can make that case in pretty straightforward psychological terms, that it's psychologically damaging to not have your testimony listened to. But I think you can also make the sort of normative claim that I want to make, right? That there's a duty to create an institution that doesn't foreclose the possibility of people giving an authentic account of a deeply traumatic experience. Is that okay?
So Saskia, perhaps the second question you can put it at the back of the line, and then I'll just respond in one line to this. It seems that if that is the case, then I'm not sure whether. So it seems then that if this is the way that you flesh out the harm, then that harm might not occur in each and every instance where people culpably refuse to tell the stories, because it might not always be disadvantaging or psychologically impairing the status seeker. So I think this is a very plausible reply that you set out, but I think it comes with this consequence that it will become conditionally wrong, because you do seem then indeed to say that someone suffers the injustice of hermeneutical injustice, or is wronged by hermeneutical injustice only insofar as they actually suffer a setback of interests, not just when there is an inequality in resources to make sense of their world and of their experiences, but also if they actually are disadvantaged by that very act.
I'm not sure I got the last bit there, but maybe we can take it offline, or because there are a couple of other questions. But I have no problem with thinking that the claim about the harm is conditional on the perspective of the applicant, because, you know, there are some people whose sense of themselves absolutely fits with the stereotype, right? And if that's the case, there's no problem here. But it is the case that lots of people say that they find the experience utterly dehumanizing and utterly alien to their sense of themselves. And I think what I'm seeking to do here is explain in normative terms why that might be the case.
Thank you, Kerri, and thank you, Johan, also for this question. So we have at least 3 questions. I've been told that the raise hand function is not functional in this particular program, so please just let me know through the chat whether you want to have a question. So Natalie first, and then we'll look at the questions by Andrew and Marlou.
Yeah, thank you, Saskia, and thank you, Kerri, for a very fascinating talk. I happened to look at the gender and SOGI materials by EASU a couple of years back, and I was actually very positively surprised. But yeah, also, well, in the UK, they are probably not used and will not be used in the future. But what struck me in your presentation was something that actually in a paper that Saskia and me wrote, we also found in refugee resettlement that this category LGBTQ is actually mostly about the L and the G, but not so much about the other letters, right? Mm-hmm. And then like this shift from behavior to identity, I mean, then you can cross the Q, I think, entirely. And then I was wondering whether you also have some evidence on what the expectations are towards trans people and how they have to perform or prove their identity. And then finally, well, I'm not coming from a theory background at all, so it's a much more applied question, but I was wondering whether you know who are the people behind these guidelines, who are the experts who design these materials, and is there a chance that they will be revised anytime soon, maybe with refugees themselves involved? So more the background to these materials. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Those are really good questions. So maybe you can send me the paper that you wrote, because I said to Saskia already, one of the disadvantages of this format is I don't get to kind of talk to you all informally and hear more about your research, which I would really be interested in doing. So if you would send me the paper, please, I would like to read it. Yeah, I completely agree that it's some letters drop out of the umbrella strangely in all kinds of contexts, actually. So to give you an example, the UK government, the Home Office, produces kind of monitoring statistics on how many people's asylum claims get granted and how many decisions get overturned on appeal and things like that. I don't know if there is a more recent set of statistics actually, because it's been an interesting year, so I'm not as up to date as I should be. But the statistics that came out last year don't include trans applicants, right? They're just missing. It's not that people didn't apply, it's that we're not counting. We're not tracking what's happening with applicants who are claiming asylum on the basis that they will be persecuted because of their gender identity. So I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure what's happening with that. Who designed the guidance? That's a really good question that I do not know the answer to. So I will think about that and I will take it away. Thank you for asking it. I can tell you who the caseworkers are, who the decision makers are. So I did recently spend a bit of time sort of learning more about that and learning more about what training they underwent to interpret these asylum policy instructions and to weigh the cases. And also, you know, more generally, sort of what is their experience of listening to pretty traumatic accounts all day? Because I don't imagine it's an easy job. You know, it can sound, I think, when I'm delivering this paper, that I think the people who are making the decision are pretty horrible. I think they've got a really tough job to do. And one of the things I found quite shocking about the job, as it were, is that the entry requirements for the job are that you have to have 2 A levels, which is not enough to get you into a university generally in Britain. So it's not a high skilled job. I'm not saying a university education is the beginning, middle and end of everything, you know, and people can be well positioned to take sensitive decisions without having gone to university, but it's quite striking the benchmark that the Home Office itself sets for people doing this job. They do get quite a bit of training and quite on-the-job support, but it's quite striking what the profile is of who the Home Office is looking for to be able to do this job. One thing I didn't say in the paper, in what I'm saying here, but I do sort of mention it in the paper, I do acknowledge it. The biggest predictor, if you like, of whether your asylum application will be accepted or not is country of origin. So country of origin overrides grounds, right? So it is not necessarily the case that you are disadvantaged in seeking asylum if you are seeking asylum on the grounds that you're LGBTQ. Country of origin sort of trumps that, if you see what I mean. But yeah, that's about all I can tell you on empirical matters, I think.
Thanks so much, Kerri. So now we're still going to be running out of time. We have
oh, sorry, I talked too much.
We have no, we are here to listen to you. But we have 5 more questions. So what I would propose is that we ask all of these questions at once, and then you will have to just cherry pick what to respond to here, and maybe we can find other ways. So I'll read out.
I can read the first one. I can read myself from Andrew Shield. Canada's doing pretty well. So Canada has developed a new set of guidelines that came out in, I think, 2018, that were developed precisely along the lines that you spoke about, Natalie. That was the other part of your question that I didn't answer, was is there any plans to revise these things? I don't know how much you know about British politics. I'm not counting on anything good happening in British Home Office in the next few years, honestly. But the Canadian guidelines were developed in partnership with support organizations who work with LGBTQ refugees. So I think Canada is doing pretty well in terms of their guidelines anyway. Yeah. And the next question, if I can read pretty quickly. I mentioned that the API needed to be revised to counter the institutional hermeneutic ignorance, but in what ways do you think, and how could we improve HEB? Oh wow, okay, that's quite a big question. And I can't see Marlo on the screen. Are you there somewhere? No.
There's also a follow-up question by Ralph who's adding to that already big question. Do you see a way to counter institutionalized hermeneutic ignorance without accepting self-identification as adequate proof?
Right. So on do I see a way to counter institutionalized hermeneutic ignorance without accepting? So I think it ought to be possible to develop better guidelines, as the Canadians have done. I think it ought to be possible to provide a bit more training and support to the caseworkers to be a bit more flexible, if you like, in how they interpret the guidelines, because the guidelines are there is a bit of flexibility in the guidelines, but there's a fair amount of evidence that they're being interpreted pretty rigidly in some cases. And then there are also things that would just improve the asylum process for everybody, that would also quite obviously improve them for LGBTQ applicants. So for example, I mean, this is really sort of stupid technical stuff, but it takes longer to write up an acceptance than to write up a reject. In terms of the institutional process that you have to go through. So in workload terms, you've got a straightforward incentive to reject people. So if you just get rid of that, that would probably make things better for everybody. There are also whistleblowers who have said they've been set targets for how many cases they have to reject. The Home Office has said that's not strictly true and that that's a misinterpretation of what's happening. But there are certainly claims that people are being given targets to deny people asylum. You know, getting rid of that would be a pretty obvious improvement. And I do think that a straightforward way of counteracting institutionalized hermeneutic ignorance is to do precisely the thing that Natalie referred to, right? Of co-producing knowledge and understanding of what it is to be LGBTQ with people who are themselves LGBTQ. There's a project that I guess people in this group might be aware of, the Sogika project, that has been run the past few years out of Sussex University, where they have also been developing sort of concrete suggestions about how to improve the decision-making process. And one of their suggestions is that you just can't have guidelines on what it is to be LGBTQ. And you have to just get rid of that idea entirely and think that you approach each case on you know, a kind of a straightforward credibility assessment about that individual's claims on its merits without having a benchmark of what a gay identity is. I don't know what I think about that, but people who've thought about it more than I have put that forward, I guess. I don't know if that, hopefully that answers the question. I see I have 4 minutes left and some more questions, I think.
Shall I just, I think it might be valuable for you to know what questions there are, even if you don't have time to answer them all. So I would invite both Robin and Lucy and Johan to still express their questions, and then we'll see how much time Kerri has to answer them. So Robin first. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Am I back?
There you are.
Okay, great. Great timing, apparently. Okay, this is maybe, it was a bit theoretical, so I'll try to shorten it down. I'm thinking a bit along the lines, is maybe the focus on identity part of the problem? Like, because, so basically, an experience of what it means to be something will always be very personal. And I was thinking along the lines, wouldn't one possibility to get out of this is to focus more on an experience, let's say, of prosecution or potential prosecution that might be less fraught to evaluate, in a sense, right? Maybe there could be something there. I was wondering what you think about this.
Thank you, Robin. Lucy?
Yeah, I feel like we're switching from the really theoretical to the really policy-facing stuff. So sorry to like throw this around. And I kind of answered, well, I didn't really answer my own question, but I kind of addressed it in the chat as well. But I was just wondering, in the context of your research, were conversations coming up about the proposal to offshore UK asylum processing and the sort of this logic of like, let's do what Australia has been doing because apparently it's been working well, because it hasn't, and it has terrible implications for queer asylum seekers. But I was just curious to see, did that come up in conversation?
So if I can take the second, oh no, is there another one? Sorry.
Oh, there's one more from Johan, and then you then you'll face the daunting challenge of responding to all of that in 2 minutes. Yeah, Johan.
Yeah. So my second question would kind of be in line with that of Robin. So now in this paper, you seem to have been focusing on the hermeneutical injustices involved in the way in which these sexual identities are conceptualized by migration policies. But there's also another way I think you can take it, namely that is indeed to think about insofar as people should be free from persecution based on their social group membership, the kind of conceptualizations of LGBTQ should be conceptualized in light of the persecuting community, and that so that the kind of conceptualization, if the persecuting community conceptualizes someone as queer and persecutes them on the basis of thereof, that should be a ground for granting people asylum, even if that conceptualization of queer is one that would be at some remove of that in the asylum granting community, right? So that could be one one further way to kind of improve the situation, to think about the kind of conceptualization of sexual group membership implicit in the persecuting society. Sorry.
Should I answer?
Yes, you will never be able to do justice to all of that.
Okay, good. Right, thank you. These are great questions. If I can deal with Lucy's question first, because I'll deal with it reasonably briefly by saying, no, I haven't been engaged in explicit conversations with that, because this term I haven't been talking to anybody. So, and it's kind of this term that's come up. But one thing I would say about that is that it's kind of hard to know how seriously to take it, because there's quite a lot of really interesting, and for interesting, read frightening signalling coming out of the UK Home Office at the moment. I don't know if you know, but we've just had this sort of advertising campaign from the Home Office where weirdly the Home Office puts out these sort of 45-second adverts that are on social media saying, we have recently successfully deported a number of foreign criminals and asylum seekers, because those belong in the same category, obviously, to Finland or wherever it is, despite the efforts of activist lawyers. So there's this sort of Home Office campaign attacking lawyers, which is really disturbing. And there's been quite a series of sort of leaks of policies, like, so that maybe we'll send asylum seekers to St. Helena or whatever, was actually a leak from the Home Office. And then the Home Office say, well, no, that was just somebody in a blue sky thinking meeting. That was never a serious policy. And then we all get to be grateful that the Home Office aren't as bad as we thought, so it's hard to know how sincere that is. But I mean, it obviously would be horrendous, right? And it obviously would be particularly horrendous for LGBTQ asylum seekers. I mean, there are lots of ways in which different groups within the asylum seeking sort of population are distinctly disadvantaged, but I think there are particular concerns for LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers in that context. Thinking about persecution, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I will need to think a little bit more about that. I mean, it's something I said at the beginning, is that the legal process should be forward-looking, right? It should be about what would happen to this person if they were returned to their country of origin, because that's the test, right? Would they face persecution? And in practice, quite often the grounds for refusal indicate that the investigation has been backward looking. And one of the difficulties is that LGBTQ people often don't have very much of an obvious record of having experienced persecution, because they've hidden the reasons why they would have been persecuted. So I think it's interesting to think in terms of what is the social construction in the persecuting context, as opposed to what is the social construction in the UK context, and would that make a difference to the kinds of decisions that are being reached? There have been a couple of interesting, you know, in an academic sense, interesting, not interesting if you're in the situation, but interesting cases of people who have claimed that they have claimed asylum on the grounds that they are LGBTQ. They have had their application denied. That has been reported in their country of origin, specifically in Kenya and Uganda, and they have then argued on appeal, and successfully argued on appeal, that because they would now be perceived to be gay in their country of origin, regardless of whether they are or not, they would be at risk of persecution because it's been reported there. So I need to think that through a bit more, how your question sort of relates to those kind of cases, because it obviously does. But thank you for the question. Thank you for all of these questions. This has all been really helpful to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerri, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I wish we were in Amsterdam now and we could go down to the Kayak Cafe, which is where we usually go to have drinks, which we will do again someday, but not this evening. But it was lovely seeing you, hearing you, and it was really good listening to you today, Kerri, and I'm really looking forward also to reading that paper. Thanks,
Right.
everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bye.